Hey, I'm Beau from Longwall Security. I'm a solutions engineer. Today, we're going to talk to you around supplier risk, risk management, and some of the recent events in the news. I'm joined by Nick Griffiths. Nick, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hello, hello. Yes, my name is Nick Griffiths. I am a security consultant here at Longwall Security. Service many of our clients, and one of the key topics at the moment being supply chain risk management.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So just quick intro for Longwall. We're an MSSP, and we look around strategy and resilience services, managed detection, intelligence response services, and risk and exposure. Today, we're really focused in on some of the current events in the news, especially around what's happening with suppliers. And without further ado, let's get stuck into it. So I've been talking to a lot of people in the industry recently, and they're concerned. They're worried about specifically suppliers because of recent events. Should they be worried?
Here's a good question. What's your risk appetite? I think that's where we start, right? What is the risk appetite currently? That's a really important one. If you're more risk averse, then what are you doing around your third party supply chain process? From kind of that initial procurement through to the continual auditing of your suppliers through the length of their contract, for example.
When we work with companies in this capacity to sort of help them understand that risk, they can have a lot of suppliers on their books. So where should they start? What's the beginning of this process to start getting that understanding of where their supplier risk is?
Identifying critical suppliers, but it's challenging, and it's a broader conversation than just the security team. But what do you class as a critical supplier? Is that critical supplier, is it due down to kind of operations? So kind of operational ability to be able to service your customers, for example? Is it down to the access that supplier has to your environment and where they could potentially laterally move to? Is it even maybe the data that supplier holds about you? There are so many different factors here, but I think the first thing is understanding what you class as a critical supplier and start to identify those critical suppliers.
People are really concerned about current events in the news, and that's one of the reasons why we're addressing this topic around suppliers today. But what recent events could we potentially learn from it, and should we be paying attention to?
Yeah, the retail incidents in the UK over the last 6 months or so, for sure. We've had the M&S breach, we've had the Co-op Group breach, JLR recently as well. And we can learn a lot from those with regards to supply chain and some of the key kind of points that we'll come on to and talk about. But it should really start to shine a light on the need to be able to really put some due diligence into supply chain from start to finish. And again, we can touch on that.
I think that is our next stopping point, then, our next touching point for this. And the question is, how did it happen? How were those organizations hit?
Social engineering. We talk a lot about kind of exploitation of vulnerabilities, etc. But a lot of social engineering has kind of led to some of this, gaining access to accounts through that, and then being able to authenticate into the environment and potentially lateral move and start living off the Landex. So really, from that perspective, education and processes is really quite key there, I'd say.
So we're seeing social engineering being used as a more common attack vector, and on particular in line with the suppliers. And it just shows year on year, companies are spending more and more in terms of cyber controls. They're metaphorically building up their walls higher and higher to try and stop this. But this attack is essentially navigating that, isn't it? It's looking for the gaps in that attack surface and going, well, I don't need to be the most sophisticated attack in the world if I can phone up and get around your organization through attacking your supplier through a social engineering exercise, right?
Yeah.
So what can these organizations be doing, considering that there's the supplier aspect, but also there's this social engineering aspect? Because there's two elements to this, I think, that need to be addressed.
No, for sure. I think the two key things are due diligence on suppliers, and we'll come on to that, but then also awareness, security awareness training, policies, auditing those and making sure that they are in a good position. I think we see it a lot with clients where they will go and implement best practice, but they're not following it through. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
If there's that continual auditing and continual approach to these processes, which may not be kind of being done.
Yeah, and I think best practices are the way we have to approach this, because we started this conversation off by saying the risk has to be calculated and we have to have a priority-based approach. So that falls into that best practice remit, right? We can't try and target everything, and there's some really kind of quick wins here in terms of implementation plans for the people that are listening to this that are concerned about this, right? So what would some of those quick wins be for those companies?
For me, first thing you need to do, identify critical suppliers.
Yeah.
Understand what you deem as critical. So whether it is kind of the effect on your operation for that supplier. So if that supplier is providing you, say, with food for you to stock your shelves, understand how, operationally, if that was to stop and they could stop providing you with stock, what happens to the business?
Yeah.
Does the supplier have access into your environment? And if they do, what can they access and how can they laterally move? And then finally, probably data. What is the data that these suppliers hold with regards to your organization? How critical is that data? And then some of that can be fleshed out within the contract and SLAs and data retention, etc. But there, I would say, kind of three good starting points.
So essentially, we're recommending that every organization listening to this should have a risk-based methodology to their supplier network, so that they understand from a criticality standpoint how these suppliers could impact the business, and also how important they are to continue those business operations from a functionality standpoint.
Yeah, how they could impact is I would say the next step. So we've gone ahead and identified critical suppliers. Let's say we've now got a list. Okay, and it is wider than security, and this is where sometimes there needs to be some ownership across the business, because it's not just around kind of the IT operations, is it, or securing that. It's understanding the dependencies for that supplier.
Yeah.
So without that supplier, what stops? And I think that's the next step. You've identified the supplier, criticality. Now understand and do a dependency map. Understand what that supplier provides to you. And once you've then done that, there are then two next key steps, which is you can start to understand those single points of failure for each of those suppliers. And then you can start to look at the contract, look at the SLAs, look at the terms, get an understanding of, if that supplier stops providing that service, what are the SLAs here?
Okay, yeah, so it's kind of that step-based approach. So it's starting off with defining, and then building out how it would impact the organization.
Like you've just said, you define what critical means to you from a supplier perspective. Then you start to identify critical suppliers, and that's a cross-business approach. Then, once you've got those and you're happy, start to really do a bit of a business impact assessment on those suppliers. And by that, I mean, understand the dependencies that you have on that supplier.
So how often, once we're looking at suppliers, should we be then reassessing those? If we are doing a risk assessment against our suppliers, what should be the repeat of this?
At minimum, annually.
Yeah.
But I would say, again, it's really dependent on the size of the organization and the resources that you have available. Okay. At minimum, at a basic level, annually, you should be reviewing these suppliers. And I'm just going to take a moment to talk about what do we mean by review.
Yeah.
That could be an internal security questionnaire that you send out to them. So you're doing some internal pieces there. You're getting their latest certifications. You're verifying that those certifications are valid. You could even look externally at the supplier. It's all good doing the internal stuff and getting them to answer a bunch of questions, but maybe look at the supplier from an external perspective. Okay, so you can do there's some really good tools out there at the moment which will hit that supplier from a public perspective and get an understanding of what's publicly exposed. Are there any misconfigurations or exploitations publicly facing on that client's environment? And that's going to give you an understanding of the external attack footprint that they have. You then take that information, aggregate that with the internal information that you've then received, and that should give you a really good kind of risk profile on that supplier. There are going to be instances where a supplier may not want to play ball. And in that case, you raise that as a risk. You elevate that risk to senior leadership level. They will have visibility over those supplier risks. And ultimately, it's up to them to make those decisions. And when it comes back round to contract renewal, that's where you can start to have those conversations again.
Sure. So we can start factoring in our approach to this even as early as sort of that onboarding phase, when we start to initially look and maybe even review select suppliers with this in mind, right? So consider that impact before they even become a supplier. Start to get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the key things that I'm doing with some of our clients at the moment is bringing it back, shifting left and bringing it right back to those initial security requirements, which is, we want to have a scored security questionnaire that they do, and they have to hit a certain threshold. They have to have certain certifications, whether it's ISO, whether it's SOC 2, for example. They have to have certain things. They have to meet a certain criteria just to take part in that procurement process.
From a human standpoint, what could we potentially do, or what could organizations be doing to start planning and preparing for raising that user awareness, making sure that they've got more resilience in that space?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. It's one that is kind of multifaceted depending on how you look at it. User awareness is key within the business. One of the things that I really try and get across when we're talking to clients about user awareness is ultimately the ethos. I want psychological safety for the employees. I want employees to feel like they can report anything. You don't want to be kind of ruling by fear, so you want clear communication pathways to be able to raise incidents, that sort of thing. From a training perspective, little and often training. Both you and I come from an education background.
Yeah.
And little and often training from the kind of studies and research out there starts to kind of get into the subconscious a little bit more than the annual training that we tend to see.
I guess a final message from me is we do work with a partner company called Panaraise. We use their platform. And I just wanted to work that in there because if you are interested in how you can monitor this supply chain risk, working with someone like Nick, who works as a consultant at Longwall, and using that information from a third-party cyber risk management tool like Panaraise, then please send us a message. Any final thoughts from yourself, Nick?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think we've covered some key things there. And I guess from my side, to summarize, it's doing due diligence early on. Not only internal due diligence through kind of the internal security questionnaires that suppliers, that you can provide suppliers, or the external footprint through something like a Panaraise, but also understanding kind of the key ties to that supplier throughout the length of the engagement. So again, if that supplier is attacked, you understand what access they currently have to your environment, so you can cut that. Then you also understand the data that they have, so you can gain an understanding of what potential data could be exfiltrated if they have been breached. And then the final thing is operationally, if they did have to close down their services, how would that impact you as a business? I think there are three really good starting points as you go through that cycle with a supplier.
Sign off here from Longwall.